she unburdened herself of her worst fears, a wild litany of nightmare and lament, her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke. Welcome to Ostracon, a podcast that translates fragments into the whole from which they came. Today we're talking about Beowulf, an extraordinary Old English epic poem that was written approximately the year 1000 and may be about a story as old as 14 or 1500 years ago. Even the manuscript of Beowulf is an extraordinary story. It seems to have been lost to history for centuries. It survived in one single manuscript that was almost destroyed in a fire in the 1700s and is actually burnt around its edges. But it has nonetheless survived to become one of the seminal works of English literature. Today, we'll take a brief overview, then go through the story with commentary. We may read a couple of excerpts, and then conclude with some interpretation. The story of Beowulf takes place in present-day Denmark and Sweden. Beowulf is the hero of the story who comes from the present-day Swedish side of the water over to the present-day Denmark side of the water to rid a king, Hrothgar, of monsters that have been attacking his mead hall. Basically, Hrothgar has built a gigantic hall adorned and designed as one of the wonders of the world, as the poem describes it. But it has been under attack for 12 years by a monster named Grendel. The story describes Beowulf coming over, defeating Grendel, then having to defeat Grendel's mother. Then, after a period of 50 years, Beowulf has become a king in his own right and goes out to a final battle against a dragon who guards a ancient hoard of gold and other treasure that has been rediscovered by a slave. And Beowulf dies in the fight against the dragon. As I say, the manuscript was produced around the year 1000 AD, give or take 50 years either way. At least that's the best current estimates. The author of the poem is anonymous. A fair amount of archaeology suggests that the poem concerns events round about the 500s AD, though there are certainly differences of opinion as to this. Historians look at, for example, the burial practices that are discussed in the poem and their likeness to known burial sites of that period. They found an excavated mead halls of that period that seem like the ones described in the poem. There is history in the poem about military engagements that are also mentioned in other sources of the period. And there are even some names that seem similar to other names of other people in those regions around that time. There's even an unexcavated burial mound in Sweden that has been proposed as the burial mound of a historical figure, Beowulf, since it meets the descriptions of the mound of Beowulf's burial in the poem and is near a place that has an ancient name very similar to the name that is used in the poem. Now, even though the story is about the area between Sweden and Denmark, the poet is actually Anglo-Saxon and wrote the manuscript in Great Britain. It's written in Anglo-Saxon Middle English to describe a place distant from where it was written, but not unrelated, because there was a fair amount of interaction between the Vikings, other northerly seafaring peoples, Germanic peoples that, of course, interacted with native peoples on the British Isles to create the diverse mix, along with Roman influences, that generated Anglo-Saxon culture on the eve of the Norman invasion. Interesting that one of the best examples of Anglo-Saxon literature seems to have been written just a matter of a couple of decades before William the Conqueror. Another interesting mix in the poem is the intersection of pagan and Christian elements, and this is another front on which there's a broad range of analysis and theories. It seems clear that the writer of the poem was Christian and puts a Christian interpretation on the events. There are times throughout the story when the actors in the story are described as doing pagan things, but it's unclear exactly how much, if at all, Christianity had permeated or maybe even mingled with the people in the story. Whether or not there was a mix of historical cultural practices and Christianity, whether there was a sense of an all-powerful even among that pantheon, and whether or not any of that was there in the story before it was amplified by the author. Beowulf bears similarities to other medieval stories. Certainly it's not the only one with a dragon, but even the freeing people oppressed by an evil form, as Beowulf does with Grendel at the beginning of the story, has been compared to other old folklore following similar narrative structures and even similar content. So we could be looking at a story that had a great deal of historical resonance and awareness and could have been handed down orally in different versions for a time, but achieving its most lasting expression in this poem. So let's tell the story of Beowulf with some observations along the way. Using the Seamus Heaney translation, it begins, "So, the speared Danes in days gone by and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns." And it begins with a history of the clan that ultimately produces a leader, a king, named Hrothgar, who builds his hall Heorot, where the first part of the story takes place. It says, "The fortunes of war favored Hrothgar. Friends and kinsmen flocked to his ranks, young followers, a force that grew to be a mighty army. So his mind turned to hall building. He handed down orders for men to work on a great mead hall meant to be a wonder of the world forever. It would be his throne room, and there he would dispense his God-given goods to young and old." It goes on, "And soon it stood there, finished and ready in full view, the hall of halls. Heorot was the name. He had settled on it, whose utterance was law. The hall towered, its gables wide and high and awaiting a barbarous burning. That doom abided, but in time it would come. The killer instinct unleashed among in-laws, the bloodlust rampant." We'll return to that later. And so he builds this incredible hall that is a glory to his kingdom, but away from society, isolated, is an enemy who hates Heorot. It says, "Then a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck and the clear song of a skilled poet telling with mastery of man's beginnings, how the Almighty had made the earth a gleaming plain girdled with waters. In his splendor he set the sun and the moon to be earth's lamplight, lanterns for men, and filled the broad lap of the world with the branches and leaves, and quickened life in every other thing that moved. So times were pleasant for the people there until finally one, a fiend out of hell, began to work his evil in the world. Grendel was the name of this grim demon, haunting the marshes, marauding around the heath and in the desolate fens. He dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters. And it goes on to describe how terrible Grendel is. Grendel comes to attack the mead hall at night while people are asleep. He's huge, great in strength. He has talon-like claws for hands, and he sneaks in and takes dozens of people at a time. Not only that, he doesn't just steal or kill the people in the hall. He eats them. The descriptions of how he eats them are quite vivid. At one point, the poem describes it like this: "In off the moors, down through the mist bands, God-cursed Grendel came greedily loping. The bane of the race of men roamed forth, hunting for prey in the high hall. Under the cloud murk he moved towards it until it shone above him, a sheer keep of fortified gold. The iron-braced door turned on its hinge when his hands touched it. Then his rage boiled over. He ripped open the mouth of the building, maddening for blood, pacing the length of the patterned floor with his loathsome tread, while a baleful light, flame more than light, flared from his eyes. He saw many men in the mansion sleeping, a ranked company of kinsmen and warriors quartered together, and his glee was demonic, picturing the mayhem. Before morning he would rip life from limb and devour them, feed on their flesh." It goes on, "He struck suddenly and started in. He grabbed and mauled a man on his bench, bit into his bone lappings, bolted down his blood, and gorged on him in lumps, leaving the body utterly lifeless, eaten up hand and foot." It is of note in the poem how evil is devouring. That is the human experience of it. Once it gets past the defenses, through the doors, and nests in the heart, it eats up more and more of the individual self and replaces it with its own malice. So because of Grendel's repeated attacks on the hall, Hrothgar's Heorot becomes deserted. Nobody will stay there anymore. For 12 years, the king is afflicted and saddened, and society and civilization has sort of ceased to be because of this oppression. The poem says, "These were hard times, heartbreaking. Powerful counselors, the highest in the land, would lend advice, plotting how best the bold defenders might resist and beat off sudden attacks. Sometimes at pagan shrines they vowed offerings to idols, swore oaths that the killer of souls might come to their aid and save the people. That was their way, their heathenish hope. Deep in their hearts they remembered hell." So whether they are pagans, but in their paganism turning to evil to save them from evil, or whether, as might be more implied by the text, they are returning to their paganism because of their desperation, in either way, their tragedy is such that they would look to anyone to save them at any price. The news of it travels far and wide, even over the waters between Denmark and Sweden, and is discovered by other vassals in Sweden who are related to Hrothgar, and one of them has in his company this young, very powerful man, Beowulf. And Beowulf, seeking glory, perhaps we'll see to a fault, decides that he will get a band of warriors, cross the waters, go to Heorot and try to free it of Grendel, which he does. And he shows up and he introduces himself to Hrothgar, and he tells about all of the things that he has done. He boasts that he's fought monsters before, that he has been successful in battle. He says, "Every elder and experienced councilman among my people supported my resolve to come here to you, King Hrothgar, because all knew of my awesome strength. They had seen me boltered in the blood of enemies when I battled and bound 5 beasts, raided a troll nest, and in the night sea slaughtered sea brutes. I have suffered extremes and avenged the gates," that's his people. "Their enemies brought it upon themselves. I devastated them. Now I mean to be a match for Grendel." In fact, he feels so strongly about it that he says he will fight Grendel in single combat, so sort of man to man, and he commits to doing it without a weapon. When Beowulf makes this pledge, he knows the fate that awaits him if he loses. He says, "I have heard, moreover, that the monster scorns in his reckless way to use weapons. Therefore, I hereby renounce sword and shelter of the broad shield. Hand to hand is how it will be, a life and death fight with the fiend. Whichever one death fells must deem it a just judgment by God. If Grendel wins, it will be a gruesome day. He will glut himself on the gates in the war hall, swoop without fear on that flower of manhood and as on others before. Then my face won't be there to be covered in death. He will carry me away as he goes to ground, gorged and bloodied. He will run gloating with my raw corpse and feed on it alone in a cruel frenzy, fouling his moor nest. No need then to lament for long or lay out my body. If the battle takes me, fate goes ever as fate must." Well, Hrothgar accepts Beowulf's offer, and Beowulf and his troop of warriors sleep in the mead hall and wait for Grendel to attack, which he does. Beowulf lies awake, waiting for Grendel. When Grendel comes in, he attacks and kills one of Beowulf's men. That's one of the excerpts I read earlier. Then he goes for Beowulf. But Beowulf, being awake, surprises him in a counterattack. He gets Grendel's arm pinned behind him and locks him there. And the two of them struggle, but Beowulf ultimately overcomes him in hand-to-hand combat, and he tears off Grendel's arm. And Grendel lopes away, dying, bleeding to death, and Beowulf hangs the arm in the mead hall to honor the victory over Grendel. As Grendel leaves, it describes his suffering. Then morning came, and many a warrior gathered, as I've heard, around the gift hall, clan chiefs flocking from far and near down wide-ranging roads, wondering greatly at the monster's footprints. His fatal departure was regretted by no one who witnessed his trail, the ignominious marks of his flight, where he'd skulked away, exhausted in spirit and beaten in battle, bloodying the path, hauling his doom to the demon's mere. The bloodshot water wallowed and surged. There were loathsome upthrows and overturnings of waves and gore and wound slurry. With his death upon him, he had dived deep into his marsh den, drowned out his life and his heathen soul. Hell claimed him there. Because of Beowulf's success, there's a great rejoicing. Beowulf is lavished with gifts. Heorot is repaired and filled again with feasting and celebrations. Beowulf receives armor, ancient named swords, other standards. One note of interest is that in this culture, the kings would give to their warriors who swore an oath of allegiance to them rings, almost like a marriage ceremony, demonstrating their bond of affection and loyalty. So the kings here are often called ring givers, and Hrothgar is called many times a great ring giver. But none of it lasts, because Grendel's mother, unknown to anyone, is out there and is angry at the loss of her son. So as soon as the celebration is begun, the next night is interrupted by Grendel's mother, who, it says, brooded on her wrongs, a different type of internal consumption. It goes on, now his mother had sallied forth on a savage journey, grief-racked and ravenous, desperate for revenge. She comes to the hall, attacks, takes Hrothgar's closest advisor, and flees and kills him. Beowulf is not there. He's been sleeping in a different chamber, but he's summoned, and he says that he'll complete his task by going after Grendel's mother. Beowulf tracks her. She lives at the bottom of a lake, and this battle is described even more mythologically than the first. It was amazing that a mere man could contend with and tear off the arm of a giant and mythological figure like Grendel. But now, when he goes to fight Grendel's mother, he must go underwater, and he can hold his breath for many, many hours, the better part of a day. He swims all the way down. He's attacked by other monstrous sea creatures that lurk around her lair, and eventually comes to her. He strikes her with one of the swords that he's been given, but it does no good. She strikes him. He's protected by his chainmail. Then he finds another ancient sword hidden in her lair, and with that, he kills her. Beowulf brings back to Heorot treasure from the lair. He also finds Grendel's body there and brings back his head to Heorot. And he gives to Hrothgar the hilt of the sword that he used to kill Grendel's mother. The sword blade itself melts away from its contact with her body, but the hilt remains. It's a relic of old times, and it says, it was engraved all over and showed how war first came into the world. And this he gives to Hrothgar. And again, there's gifts and celebration, because Heorot, again, is safe. Now, we started out by saying that there were three monsters in the story: Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon, which is the final piece that we're about to get to. But let me interpose a question here. Who is this Beowulf, which translates to something like bear man? He can hold his breath all day long, fight underwater, contend with huge mythical creatures, and is even stronger than them. Yet he's supposed to be just a person. He has this selfless desire to fight for others. He comes from over the sea to Heorot, where he has no business being, to try and protect a people that he doesn't have to protect. But before you call him a savior figure, you have to ask if his acts are really selfless, because he comes over boasting about all the great things that he has done, and there's a great measure of pride in how he approaches the struggle. He wants it to be hand-to-hand. He gives up the use of weapons, which ultimately you find out that weapons wouldn't have worked on Grendel anyway because of some magical power that he has. But the point is, he goes in with incredible surety. Maybe he's driven by his own kind of monster longing for pride and glory. On the other hand, he's a bit of a David figure, going into a fight that is destined to be uneven, and he puts his faith that if the just result is for him to win, then it would be so. even despite the odds. And at least as it's told through the mouth of the poet, whether it's the historical truth or not, Beowulf seems to trust in that notion of justice. He trusts that it would be right and fair to prevail over this monster that is oppressing and devouring what should be a place of togetherness, of civilization, of joy. So he trusts in the fairness of his cause and is totally aware of the fact that he may die, but is willing to die. He's willing to die for that trust. So he seems to be an imperfect mix of all these things. He seems maybe to have a fourth monster in the story of pride driving him on, and there'll be more of that in the third episode with the dragon. But he also seems to have faith and to put himself on the line for that faith. Now let's move to the third and final episode. When Beowulf returns home, there's a whole nother series of the poem where he recounts his struggles in Heorot and is awarded again by his own king in his homeland. 50 years pass. Beowulf becomes king after various wars caused the death of the prior king in his homeland. And he rules for 50 years. But then there is a new mythological menace. This time it's a dragon. The dragon's treasure is discovered by a slave. That's what brings the dragon out into the open, attacking Beowulf's people. The poem says, "One began to dominate the dark, a dragon on the prowl, from the steep vaults of a stone-roofed barrow where he guarded a hoard. There was a hidden passage unknown to men, but someone managed to enter it and interfere with the heathen trove. He had handled and removed a gem-studded goblet. It gained him nothing, though with a thief's wiles he had outwitted the sleeping dragon. That drove him into a rage, as the people of that country would soon discover. The intruder who broached the dragon's treasure and moved him to wrath had never meant to. It was desperation on the part of a slave, fleeing the heavy hand of some master, guilt-ridden and on the run, going to ground. But soon he began to shake with terror. In shock, the wretch panicked and ran away with the precious metalwork. There were many other heirlooms heaped inside the earth house, because long ago, with deliberate care, somebody now forgotten had buried the riches of a high-born race in this ancient cache. Death had come and taken them all in times gone by, and the only one left to tell their tale, the last of their line, could look forward to nothing but the same fate for himself. He foresaw that his joy in the treasure would be brief." So, a long time ago, an ancient peoples, in a sense of loss and hopelessness, took the treasure that they had and buried it underground in some kind of a cave. And a dragon comes and for who knows how many centuries hoards it to himself. Again, that image of evil kind of nesting within and hoarding. And the dragon seems fine so long as nobody bothers him. But this slave is apparently in need of money, is deathly afraid that if he doesn't find it, he's going to suffer. And by chance, maybe while he's in hiding, he stumbles upon this cave and upon the treasure. So there is, aside from the dragon, another evil in the world of need and want and fear that drives this person to awaken what in the poem is a visible manifestation of evil, the dragon. The dragon then goes out and burns up the countryside, homesteads and other buildings. It says, "Beowulf was given the bad news, a hard truth. His own home, the best of buildings, had been burnt to a cinder, the throne room of the gates. It threw the hero into a deep anguish. His mind was in turmoil. Unaccustomed anxiety and gloom confused his brain. The fire dragon had razed the coastal region and reduced forts and earthworks to dust and ashes. So the war king planned and plotted his revenge. The warrior's protector, prince of the Hall troop, ordered a marvelous all-iron shield from his smithy works. He well knew that linden boards would let him down and timber burn. After many trials, he was destined to face the end of his days in this mortal world, as was the dragon, for all his long leasehold on the treasure. Yet the Prince of the Rings was too proud to line up with a large army against the sky plague. He had scant regard for the dragon as a threat, no dread at all of its courage or strength, for he had kept going often in the past, through perils and ordeals of every sort, after he had purged Hrothgar's hall, triumphed in Heorot, and beaten Grendel. He outgrappled the monster and his evil kin. And Beowulf goes on to think of his other triumphs, and motivated again by that pride, even 50 years after the fact, thinking himself equally strong and capable, he decides to go and attack the dragon alone. The poem says, "He drew himself up beside his shield. The fabled warrior in his war shirt and helmet trusted in his own strength entirely, and went under the crag, no coward path." There is a difference here, in that in the fight with Grendel, while he's certainly motivated by pride, he expresses a belief that good must prevail. And if it's meant to happen through him, then it will. And if it's not, then it won't. But this battle is different. He doesn't trust in anything beyond himself. He trusts in his own strength entirely. The poem says, "Down there in the barrow, Beowulf the warrior lifted his shield. The outlandish thing writhed and convulsed and viciously turned on the king, whose keen-edged sword, an heirloom inherited by ancient right, was already in his hand. Roused to a fury, each antagonist struck terror in the other. Unyielding, the lord of his people loomed by his tall shield, sure of his ground, while the serpent looped and unleashed itself. Swaddled in flames, it came gliding and flexing and racing toward its fate. Yet his shield defended the renowned leader's life and limb for a shorter time than he meant it to. That final day was the first time when Beowulf fought and fate denied him glory in battle. So the king of the gates raised his hand and struck hard at the enameled scales, but scarcely cut through. The blade flashed and slashed, yet the blow was far less powerful than the hard-pressed king had need of at that moment. The glittering sword, infallible before that day, failed when he unsheathed it, as it never should have. It was no easy thing to have to give ground like that, and go unwillingly to inhabit another home in a place beyond, so every man must yield the leasehold of his days. And now we encounter what might be the fifth monster of the story, which is the fear in Beowulf's friends. They were there outside the dragon's den, but it says no help or backing was to be had from his high-born comrades. That hand-picked troop broke ranks and ran for their lives to the safety of the wood. There's only one person named Wiglaf who remains loyal to Beowulf. He runs in beside Beowulf and says, "Go on, dear Beowulf, do everything you said you would when you were still young, and vowed you would never let your name and fame be dimmed while you lived. Your deeds are famous, so stay resolute, my lord. Defend your life now with the whole of your strength. I shall stand by you." He goes and fights alongside Beowulf. He eventually gets a sword into the belly of the dragon, which causes his fire to diminish, and allows Beowulf then to draw a dagger and strike a final fatal blow also in the belly. But by then it is too late. Beowulf is inspired by Wiglaf's help. He takes a giant sword stroke with the dragon's head, and his sword breaks. Then it says, that bane of the people, the fire-breathing dragon, was mad to attack for a third time. When a chance came, he caught the hero in a rush of flame and clamped sharp fangs into his neck. Beowulf's body ran wet with his life-blood. It came welling out. It's while he's dying that he strikes the fatal blow to the dragon, and the both of them stretch out there on the ground to die together. Wiglaf stands by Beowulf and talks with him and comforts him in his last moments. Beowulf discovers that the bite has poison in it, and it moves about inside him. Interesting that the poison of the dragon can be caught by another. One of the things that Beowulf asks for before he dies is to see the treasure. And Wiglaf goes in and finds an extraordinary amount of all types of gold hidden inside the dragon's lair, and he brings some of it to show it to Beowulf so that he feels that at least something has come of this final fatal venture. Beowulf says, to the everlasting Lord of all, to the King of glory, I give thanks that I behold this treasure here in front of me, that I have been allowed to leave my people so well endowed on the day I die, now that I have bartered my last breath to own this fortune. But it's interesting to hear this treasure described because it's been abandoned underground for so long that a lot of it has wasted away and become worthless. While there are astonishing riches, it also says that the old dawn-scorching serpent's den was packed with goblets and vessels from the past, tarnished and corroding, rusty helmets all eaten away. Elsewhere, beside the dead body of the dragon, it says, there were pitchers and piled-up dishes, silent flagons, precious swords eaten through with rust, ranged as they had been while they waited their 1,000 winters underground. Before Beowulf dies, he asks to be buried in a large mound overlooking the coast. Imagining the funeral pyre that will burn him up before he is buried in the mound, and imagining the aftermath of that funeral, they say, we must take a last look at the king and launch him, lord and lavisher of rings, on the funeral road. His royal pyre will melt no small amount of gold. Heaped there in a hoard, it was bought at a heavy cost, and that pile of rings he paid for at the end with his own life will go up with the flame, be furled in fire. Treasure no follower will wear in his memory, nor lovely woman link and attach as a torque around her neck. But often repeatedly in the path of exile they shall walk bereft, bowed under woe, now that their leader's laugh is silenced, high spirits quenched. Many a spear dawn cold to the touch will be taken down and waved on high. The swept harp won't waken warriors, but the raven, winging darkly over the doomed, will have news, tidings for the eagle of how he hoked and ate, how the wolf and he made short work of the dead. Now that they have lost their king, and he has no heir, there is no plan. He's gone out and failed in this brazen and prideful attack. And they are all undefended. And they all remember the old feuds among relatives and other clans and other families, and they all expect now to be attacked and destroyed and to suffer. And there is a great fear and a foreboding that comes over the land now that Beowulf is gone and there is no king to follow. They build him a pyre, stacked and decked until it stood foursquare, hung with helmets, heavy war shields, and shining armor, just as he had ordered. So his pyre is a picture of the battles of his life. His warriors laid him in the middle of it. On a height they kindled the hugest of all funeral fires. Fumes of wood smoke billowed darkly up. The blaze roared and drowned out their weeping. Wind died down and flames wrought havoc in the hot bone house, burning it to the core. They were disconsolate and wailed aloud for their lord's decease. A gate woman, too, sang out in grief. With hair bound up, she unburdened herself of her worst fears. A wild litany of nightmare and lament. Her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke. What a line. Heaven swallowed the smoke. And it takes me back to something I said to take note of as we read some of the very early lines of the poem describing Heorot. It described it as a wonder of the world, but nonetheless noted that it was fated to be destroyed. It said that it would eventually all be burned up in flames. It said, the hall towered, its gables wide and high and waiting a barbarous burning. That doom abided, but in time would come. So from the very outset, not in the same place as the fear among Beowulf's people, but in the same way, all the glory of Heorot that Beowulf risks his life to defend at the beginning of the story, the writer knows, in hindsight, is destined for doom, is destined to be swallowed up in these battles for power among peoples. And now, 50 years later, when King Beowulf is dead, his people face the same foreboding, the same sense of inescapability of conflict. So what do we make of this? This mix of heroism and courage and violence and war and failure and pride and foreboding and ultimately inescapability, even hopelessness. Beowulf goes out to help others, but no one is there to help him. He's abandoned. And everyone is ultimately abandoned. We can take three things from it. Number one, that evil is real. The evil has physical, mythological manifestations in the story, but it represents a truth we know from our own lives. We see the injustice of the world. We live with the temptations and struggles and hoarded up wrongs within ourselves. And the poem says we have to fight it. We have to take up courageously and fight it because it is a devouring force. It's a force that eats up society, relationship, joy, even culture. The story says we must bravely take up a stand against it, or else the world is reduced, as Heorot was in the beginning, to empty walls. All right? But number two, when we take it up, we can't take it up for the sake of the world. Because if the fight against one oppressor is just for the sake of the world is full of other oppressors. Be they others who mean ill, or be they just the contingent nature of life, that we get sick, that we get old and die, that we suffer from want and from lack. Beowulf fights to save Heorot, but from the very beginning of the poem, we know that there's a certain futility to it, because even though it's saved for a while, Heorot ultimately will be destroyed. It will be burned down. And so to save that building doesn't do it. The building won't be there. There's got to be something else that you're saving. Beowulf goes out and gives his life for the treasure. He asks to see it before he dies and says, "At least I know that as I breathe my last breath, I've endowed my people with this treasure." But what happened last time to the treasure? All the people that held it were gone. That's why it ended up buried in the earth for how many unknown centuries, rusting away. And Beowulf's own people see, maybe with clearer eyes than Beowulf did, what good will this treasure do if we can't stand against all of those who are coming to take it and to make slaves of us? So all of the foreboding of the poem suggests that to replace the evil that we attack with something that is no more transcendent, something that is just a part of the entropy and falling apart of the world, won't do it. When we take the stand has to be more like Beowulf in his first fight, when he trusts that the good should prevail and is willing to give his life for it. Maybe he does it imperfectly, as any of us would, with a mix of pride and other motivations, but he comes to the point where he will stake his life for something that he believes in, and he trusts in something greater than himself. It can't be like the battle at the end that he loses, when he trusts only in his own strength. As the dragon sits over its hoard, he sits over his confidence in the glories and the victories of his young life, and thinks that they will carry him through, but they cannot, and he comes against his mortality. The fight against the evils in the world has to come from and be directed to the higher good that is beyond our own selves, but is the source of good, the source of the good in us, the source of our life, the source of our courage, the hope that we have that when we do stake our lives for the good, that it will come to something, because it is a permanent good in God that is beyond the falling apart of the world that is inescapable. Third, Beowulf's battle with evil stands as a counterpoint to Christ. You can't identify Beowulf as a Christ-like figure for all the reasons that we've been reviewing here, but you can compare his battles to the victory won by Christ in the cross and the resurrection in a way that is illuminating of what Christ did. Beowulf puts aside his weapons and is willing to fight man to man in single combat with his bare hands. So God takes on the human person, the flesh, the human body itself, to go in person, face to face to death, the funeral road, as it's called in the poem, that everyone walks. He goes there where we go, in his own humanness, and he faces it in single combat, so to speak, as each one of us must and will. He faces it without weapons, so to speak. In the ultimate humility of God made man, he goes in all the weaknesses of the flesh, pierced, crowned with thorns, to die. The Son trusts in the salvific plan of God. In taking the body through death and into resurrection, he remakes the human person and reunites us with our destiny to God, as intended from the beginning. If God is all-knowing, he made us knowing that we would fall, that we would die, that he would be one with us, to carry the human flesh into the resurrection in a way that at the same time both destroys death and does no violence to our free will to choose and follow. God the Son, Christ, is obedient to God the Father. God is faithful to his own intent from the beginning, that out of love he would make us, that he would save us, that he would return us to him. He took up this suffering when he made us, because he loved us, and did not want to abandon us to this foreboding falling apart of the world. This ultimate faithfulness unto death is beyond what any hero, what any Beowulf, what any person can ever achieve. That salvific act is unique unto God. But the poem helps us to imagine how we might make the good fight in our own way, not for ourselves, not for the transient things of the world, but in trust of something greater, in trust of the good and the just and the true, to the point where we're willing to put our lives on the line. And this poem maybe can help us imagine better, out of the struggles and the losses and the triumphs of the world, how our battle can more resemble the person of Christ. I think again of that line, "Heaven swallowed the smoke of the funeral pyre." It all goes up to God as the source of everything, as the only thing that is. The rings in the funeral pyre are all melted, never to be worn again. But the smoke, the incense, so to speak, of a life lived, go up to heaven. And even as, however much of this story was true some 1,500 years ago, even as all of those things have been destroyed, and as I mentioned in the beginning, we're picking through and trying to put together their little fragments. Even the language of Beowulf, Anglo-Saxon, is a dead language. And as we mentioned, the work was written on the eve of the Norman invasion. Even as all these things have been destroyed, this one manuscript, which survived a fire, comes through to us with a message of a life, a flawed life, with a message. Direct your life towards God. All else passes away.